Hi, cousins. My name's Stephen Lyle Cooper, and I am a descendant of William Draper Jr. twice. So, through my mom's line and my dad's line, through two of William's different wives. So, one through Elizabeth Staker, and then also Mary Ann Howarth. So, both for both parents, I'm related to William Draper Jr. So, I felt very inspired to put out some YouTube videos and Audible type content about William Draper and his life. So, this is actually a recording of William Draper's autobiography that he wrote. If you go to Family Search, you can read it. But like me, I'm a Audible. Like I like to listen to stuff, listen to podcasts. So I used AI to create and to read his own autobiography, so you can listen to it. So that's what this is. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. Hope you can feel the faith William Draper Jr. and learn from his pioneering spirit and the things that he had to go through. I know this has given me a lot of strength in my life as I've, overcome obstacles and had hard challenges. I've reflected on the things that he went through, and this has been a big support for me. So hope you enjoy this AI recording of William Draper Jr.'s autobiography.
An autobiographical sketch of the life and travels of William Draper Jr. My grandfather's name was Thomas Draper, and my grandmother's maiden name was Lydia Rogers. My father and grandfather were born in the state of Pennsylvania, and I was born in the province of Upper Canada, township of Richmond, county of Frontenac, Midland District, on the 24th day of April in the year 1807. In June of the year 1832, I heard the gospel preached for the first time by Elder Miller and others in his company. In January of the same year, I heard Brigham Young preach the same gospel, and I believed it. And it was all in the township of Longborough, Upper Canada. I was baptized on the 20th day of March in the year 1833. In June of the same year, I was ordained a priest under the hands of Brigham Young. I bore testimony, traveled, and preached as circumstances permitted until the 11th day of September in the year 1834. I then, in company with Daniel Wood and his family, with my own family consisting of my wife and two children, bid adieu to Canada, my birthplace, and to my father, mother, brothers, and sisters for the sake of the gospel. We traveled together with the saints to Kirtland, Ohio, which we reached on the 24th day of the same month. I was satisfied and rejoiced at meeting some of my old friends, brethren from Canada, and even more satisfied to see the face and hear the voice of the prophet Joseph, from whom and his brethren I received much valuable instruction. I then went to work and found a location, built myself a house, and by hard labor provided a comfortable living for my family, which then consisted of my wife and three children. Though I was quite poor as to worldly goods, I labored faithfully and prospered exceedingly. The next spring, in the year 1835, at the April conference, by a unanimous vote, the walls of the basement of the temple, which had been covered the previous fall, were uncovered, and the work of building the Kirtland Temple resumed with a covenant to finish the walls that season. I contributed my labor with the rest of my brethren, though we were but few to undertake such a great work, but it was done. I also went to Canada that summer on a short mission, was abundantly blessed, and returned again in September to my family and to the Society of the Church in Kirtland. During the following winter, I had the privilege of attending the theological school, which was superintended by the prophet Joseph and his counselors. From them, I received much good instruction preparatory to the endowment when the Kirtland Temple was finished. During that time, I was placed in the presidency of the priests' quorum, which the bishops presided over. During the meetings in the endowment, I had the opportunity of forming new, valuable acquaintances, including Bishop Edward Partridge of Zion or Missouri and Bishop N.K. Whitney of Kirtland, with their respective counselors. Under their hands, I received many great ordinances and blessings, they being the only bishops in the church at that time. The 12 apostles and the first quorum of 70s were chosen about that time. There in the Kirtland Temple, on the day of Pentecost, the 6th day of April in the year 1836, there was such an outpouring of the Spirit of the Lord that my pen is inadequate to write it fully or my tongue to express it. But I will say that the Spirit was poured out like a mighty rushing wind and filled the house. Many present spoke in tongues, had visions, saw angels, and prophesied, rejoicing in a manner not known in this generation. Then all things remained quiet until about the 1st of June. The quorum of the 12 was sent to the eastern states and Canada to hold conferences and regulate affairs in the church abroad. I was counseled by the prophet to go on a mission, which I did. I traveled in company with them to Loughborough in Canada, where I had formerly lived, and joined the church. We held several meetings and conferences, set branches in order, baptized quite a number, and rejoiced to see the Lord blessing our labors. In this place, we parted ways. The 12 continued their mission further east, down the St. Lawrence River, crossing into the States by that route home. I traveled on the north side of Lake Ontario by way of Toronto, crossed Lake Ontario to Lewiston, and returned home by that route, finding all well and rejoicing in the blessings of the gospel. Things went on comfortably and pleasantly during the ensuing fall and winter. By the assistance and counsel of the prophet, I prospered exceedingly well, so that I obtained a nice little farm of 20 acres, on which I built a good, comfortable house and made other suitable improvements for the comforts of life. All went well until sometime in the summer of the year 1837, when speculators and travelers began to creep in, which changed the state of affairs financially throughout Kirtland. This damaged me to the amount of over $1,000. I lost my team and other good property, but during the ensuing winter, we had a good time in the temple. I was called upon to be ordained a high priest, and was ordained under the hands of Don Carlos Smith and his counselors. Don Carlos Smith was president of the high priest quorum and a brother to the prophet Joseph. I was then set apart to go to Illinois the coming spring, in the year 1838, to take charge and preside over a branch of the church that had previously been raised up. I went to work with might and main to make up an outfit, and I succeeded in procuring a team and wagon, as I intended to take my family with me. Many of the saints were preparing to leave Kirtland in the spring, and I never expected to return there again. I expected the avails of my little farm and home to supply me with the means to get another home, if I should be so happy as to reach far west, where we all aimed to make a permanent home, as we thought at the time. But let me here say that I was sadly mistaken and seriously disappointed. Instead of having the means to buy me another home in far west, lo and behold, a Christian Gentile had me in his clutches and swindled me out of my little home, so I never got one dime for the whole. He made me believe that if I would stay and live on the farm, I should have it for my lifetime to support my family. If not, he would keep it, for he said he might as well have it as old Joseph Smith. And so he kept it, although he had received every dollar of his pay for it. This was the fruit of Mr. Branch's religion, although a stray Presbyterian. But as I do not intend to expose other people's faults, I will let the above suffice and resume my own travels. I will say that this affair gave me another opportunity to leave father and mother, brothers and sisters, house and land, for the gospel's sake. I hastened to start on my mission to Morgan County, Illinois, which I accomplished. I started on the 16th day of April in the year 1838, having only my family consisting of my wife and 5 children for company. That was all I had to travel with for the first 120 miles. I then lay weather-bound for a week due to a storm that made the roads impassable. While laying by, a number of brethren came up, some from Canada and some from Kirtland, Ohio. Among that company were George A. Smith, his father and mother, and his brother John. I fell in with them, and we traveled on through mud and mire for 2 or 3 weeks, and finally reached my destination sometime in May, namely Morgan County, Illinois. I stayed there, finding the place of my appointment already filled by the previous action of the branch. I was satisfied and concluded to make my way on to far west. I took leave of the brethren and traveled in that direction until sometime in the latter part of June, when I was brought down with a severe attack of sickness. I was obliged to camp by the wayside. There stood a big oak tree, and under it a nice plot of grass. There I took up my abode for a little season. This was at Huntsville, Randolph County, in the state of Missouri, about 125 miles from far west. After laying there several days, I was taken up by a good Samaritan and lodged in the house of a brother by the name of Edward Weaver, where my needs were simply provided for, and I soon began to revive and get better. After laying there a few days, another company came along from Kirtland, bound for far west. In that company were the prophet's father and mother and 2 brothers, namely Hiram and William Smith and their families. The old gentleman, the only living patriarch then known in the church, was invited and entreated to stop and hold a blessing meeting, which he did. It was a glorious meeting, for the Spirit of the Lord was poured out abundantly, and I had an open vision or presentiment concerning much of the suffering of the saints, especially that of the Smith family. I proclaimed it to the congregation, and it affected the old patriarch so that he wept like a child and said the vision was true and from the Lord, which in a few weeks or months proved to be true, as will be seen by what followed in the coming fall. Father Smith and his 2 sons tarried 5 days with us after the meeting and organized the place or branch into a temporary stake of Zion, as a resting place for the saints who were worn out from traveling eastward. In this organization, I was set apart by them, the Smiths, to take charge and preside, which I did to the best of my ability until sometime in August, when a message came to us instructing us to break up our organization and come to Caldwell County, as there were strong indications of hostilities from the mob. We hastened to comply with the instructions received from the prophet, and within a few days, we were on our way to Far West. However, the mob had become so hostile that after traveling a day or two, we began to feel that it was not safe to continue on the main road through the settlements, as the spirit of mobocracy was opposed to any more saints gathering in Far West. So we concluded to leave the main road and took a by-road that led through sparsely settled country for about 15 or 20 miles. When that road ended, we took a route across an uninhabited country without any road for about 40 miles, which brought us out at the renowned Haun's Mill. From there, we continued through Caldwell County to within about 4 or 5 miles of Far West, where we concluded to stop and make our home. There was a large branch of the church there, known as the Lay Creek Branch. I bought myself a snug little home consisting of a log house, a blacksmith shop, and 7 acres of good land under cultivation with a strong rail fence around it. That purchase took all of my means to pay for, leaving me with only 1 yoke of oxen, 1 horse, and 2 cows. But corn and pork were plentiful, corn being the main breadstuff then, so I set to work at shoemaking and soon made my family comfortable again. In a short time, I was called upon to take the presidency of this branch, being the only high priest in it. I accepted the appointment, and all things went on comfortably, notwithstanding the excitement that reigned in the surrounding country. Hostilities increased daily from the mobs outside, particularly in the adjoining counties. Finally, by the middle of October, hostilities had escalated so much that we received another message from the prophet, requesting that all of us in the outlying settlements come into Far West City. We readily complied with the counsel, and many of the brethren tore down their log houses and moved into the city. I did not tear down my house, but I went into the city with the rest of my brethren from that branch and took shelter in an old log cabin with 3 other families. This required some patience, for one of the families, by the name of Fowles, apostatized and joined the mob. I have not heard from them since. I will say here that after we arrived in the city, there was quite a stir among the people. Reports came daily, almost hourly, that mobs were gathering on every side, keeping us on constant lookout day and night. On or about the 22nd day of October, there came a report that the mob was destroying houses, ruining property, and killing our brethren, who had not yet gathered into Far West, but were living about 12 or 14 miles out. Upon hearing the report, a company of about 75 men was raised and dispatched to investigate. They traveled until they reached the place of trouble near what was called Crooked River. There, they came in contact with the mob, which opened fire on our brethren. A skirmish ensued, resulting in the death of David W. Patton, one of the 12 apostles, as well as Simeon Carter and a young man by the name of Patrick O'Banion. Several other brethren were badly wounded. When the company returned to the city, it cast a gloom over the whole place. Still, most of the brethren maintained their integrity, though some faltered. Nevertheless, there were enough faithful brethren left to keep watch, stand guard, and do what was required until about 3 or 4 days later, on the 27th or 28th day of October, in the year 1838, while on duty watching for the mob, we saw their glittering armor about 2 miles in the distance. They were approaching in the direction of our city, which created quite a stir. Within minutes, about 200 men, both old and young, mustered in the public square. We were immediately marched to the southern boundary of the city to defend our wives, children, and property from destruction. When we arrived at our post, the mob had reached a low piece of ground along the borders of Goose Creek, where some scattered timber concealed them from our view. Some of them climbed into the trees and looked over into the city. We later learned from our brethren, who were prisoners in their camp, that they swore they saw an army of thousands in the city. The sight of what they thought was a great army caused terror in their camp and led them to halt for a short time. Soon after, we saw a flag raised by a few men approaching us. It was a detachment or committee consisting of 4 men, namely George M. Hinkle, Colonel Judge Phillips, John Carroll, and Reed Peck. They were chosen and sent with a white flag to meet the flag that was coming toward us. They met within our sight, though we could not hear what was said. Then they all went to the enemy's camp together. In a short time, the committee returned to our ranks and said that it was a government army sent by Governor Boggs to investigate the difficulties, if possible. They requested that Joseph and his counselors, along with the 12, come immediately to their camp to hold a council. Upon hearing this, Joseph said he would go, as he did not wish to contend or resist the government. So he, along with all the required brethren who were present, started immediately with the committee toward the army camp. They soon met the flag, borne by a number of officers, and, to our great surprise, were delivered over by the committee to the officers as prisoners of war. They were then taken into the enemy's camp, where the soldiers began yelling and howling like demons from the lower regions. We did not know what all the noise meant. Soon after, our committee returned and told us that Joseph and the brethren would stay all night in council with the officers and be sent home at 8 o'clock the next morning. They also warned us that there were rough and ungovernable characters in the crowd, and we had better stand to our arms and be prepared to defend ourselves and our families. It was nearly sunset. We immediately set to work and threw up a breastwork using house logs, planks, wagons, slabs, wagon boxes, and any other materials we could find. By morning, we had built about a half to 3/4 of a mile of fortification, a beautiful breastwork considering our circumstances. None of us had eaten or drunk anything since the morning before, as our wives and children dared not come to us. After waiting some time the next morning, our committee again went to the camp to learn the result of the council. After a short absence, they returned and reported that a treaty had been effected. We were to lay down our arms as evidence of our peaceful intentions and sign over our property to the state to cover the expenses of the war. They said Joseph had agreed to all this and that the army would soon come up to enforce the treaty. We were told we must act accordingly. That was a tough pill to swallow, but if Joseph said so, then all right. Sure enough, in a short time, we saw the army approaching. They marched up to our ranks and formed a hollow square. We were marched into it by our commander, Colonel Hinkle. We were then ordered to lay down our arms, which we did. We were completely divested of every weapon, even our large pocket knives were taken. While this was going on, another hollow square was formed. There we stood, waiting for their orders. Every now and then a woman would come crying, saying we would all be shot down in a few minutes. The soldiers, at the same time, were busy picking their flints, priming their guns, and preparing to fire. Then their general said, "I suppose you are tired. You can sit down on the grass and rest a little," which was quite a favor, and we sat down. The side of the square where I ended up was made up of painted demons proven to be the old Jackson County militia. After sitting a little while, I became drowsy from fatigue and hunger. I lay myself down on the grass with my feet toward the painted demons and soon fell into a snooze. On hearing some sudden movement, I awoke and, fearing they might shoot me in the legs, I changed my position and lay down again, this time with my head toward them, and fell into a pleasant sleep. But I was soon awakened by the word of command, "Men, arise to your feet." We were then marched away into the city by the side of the army. After receiving some instructions from the general, we were allowed to return to our families within the city, though we were warned not to attempt to leave the city under threat of peril. Yet, this was quite a privilege, as many of us had not eaten for nearly 2 days. After supper, we retired to our beds, glad for a little rest. We had been advised to keep our houses dark or risk being shot. Throughout the night, we could hear gunfire, dogs yelping, hogs squealing, and the howling, yelling, cursing, and swearing of the soldiers. After this night of confusion, we arose in the morning to see hogs, dogs, and sheep lying dead in the streets and gateways that led out of the city. They had been shot by the ruffians, who apparently believed they were people running on all fours. The mob committed many other depredations, including stealing, raping, and worst of all, shameful abuse of some of our most worthy and virtuous women. I will now relate a short conversation that took place between a boy of about 12 years old, named Budawas Dustin, and a Methodist preacher, also a captain of a company and chaplain for the army named Samuel Bogard. One evening, while the boy was present, the army was called to order for evening services, including a solemn prayer and thanks to their unknown God for the glorious works he was permitting and assisting them to perform. When the prayer ended, the boy stood as if in deep thought and said, "Mr. Bogard, can I ask you one question?" "Yes, boy," was the answer. The boy continued, "Mr. Bogard, sir, which way do you think is right to have your eyes closed or open when you pray?" "Well, my boy, I suppose either would be acceptable if done in humility, though it looks more humble to have our eyes closed against the distractions of the world," the preacher answered. "Well," said the boy, "I think if I were engaged in such a work as you are, I would want my eyes open." "Why, my boy?" came the inquiry. "Because I'd be afraid the devil would carry me off if they were shut." They then threatened the boy's life for being a young Mormon, but he replied, "I am no Mormon," and he was not at the time. So he escaped, though he subsequently joined the church. Now, I return to the events of the following day. After breakfast, we were all called to the public square in the city of Far West and required to sign deeds to our property to pay the expenses of the war. Yet Joseph did not come, and we knew little of what was happening. I will now mention something that occurred on the first night in camp. 4 of our brethren, prisoners in the enemy camp, were allowed to come into the city with a brother named William Carey, an old acquaintance whom I had baptized in Canada about 3 years earlier. He was brought home on a board with his skull crushed by his own gun, struck by the hands of a mobber named William Donihue. Brother Carey died the next day a harmless, innocent man, giving no offense except for his religion, for which he was murdered. After most of the property deeds had been signed, we were called to witness one of the most heart-wrenching scenes. Joseph and his brethren were brought from the enemy camp and driven up to their families, where they were allowed only a few moments to say farewell, being told they would never see them again. One of the wives was in a condition that required her husband's care, yet he was dragged away by a ruthless mob, never expected to return. It was a harrowing scene, husbands and wives in the hands of a merciless group. But the Lord overruled all and delivered them in his own due time. We learned that, while in the camp, Joseph and his brethren were not in fact in council with the officers as promised. Rather, they were suffering abuse and undergoing a mock trial by court-martial for crimes they were never guilty of. The court found them guilty and sentenced Joseph and his companions to be shot the following morning at 8 o'clock. General Alexander Doniphan and his command were appointed to carry out the execution, but he refused, stating it would be nothing but cold-blooded murder. Early the next morning, he placed his men under marching orders and moved them about 3 miles away from the main army to avoid witnessing the act or being implicated. General Doniphan, being a noted lawyer, caused some uneasiness among the other officers. This led them to reconsider and change their decision. They decided instead to send Joseph and the other prisoners to Liberty Jail in Jackson County, among the old mobbers, and provided a guard to escort them there safely. After the prisoners were taken and the day's business concluded, we were called together to listen to a final piece of counsel and advice from the commanding officer, General Clark. Then we were to be dismissed. This was the best of all the events that had occurred. His speech went nearly as follows. "Now, men, I will say that you have thus far complied with the treaty made with your leaders by giving up your arms and deeding over your property to pay the expenses of this war, which you instigated. I think you must feel as though you've been dealt with very leniently. Our orders were to exterminate you all without discrimination, but since you have thus far complied, you will now be allowed to go and carry out the rest of the treaty's terms, which are that you must leave the state of Missouri by planting time in the spring or be exterminated or driven out at the point of the bayonet or rifle. One of those two things must and will be done. Now, I will give you a piece of good advice. When you are discharged, go and provide for the wants of your families. Make speedy preparations to leave this state and find a place wherever you can. Scatter about like other people. Never again gather together in companies, not even in groups of 10, under presidents, prophets, bishops, or apostles to govern you. If you do, you will bring down the wrath of a just people upon you, as you have done before. Now, men, if you heed this command and advice, it will be well with you. I will now invoke the blessings of the great unknown God upon you to help you do so. You are now dismissed to carry out these measures. After prowling about the city for a day or two more, and gathering what they could manage of our most valuable belongings, the mob finally concluded to leave, which they did, taking with them a few apostates whom we could very well spare. Now was the time for us to return to the homes we had been forced to leave. Most of us did so. I soon set about locating my team, which I had turned loose on the prairie when I came into the city. I went in the direction of the soldiers' camping place and soon found the heads of my oxen lying in the road near their camp. That sight stopped me from searching any further, and I returned to the city. I borrowed the team belonging to the widow Carey, whose husband the mob had just killed a few days earlier, to move us back to our home. I did so on the condition that I would take her with us and care for her and her team until she could leave the state. I agreed to this and carried it out. Upon arriving home, I could find but one cow remaining. I had left two, but after a short search, I found the head and hide of the other. She had been destroyed. That left me with one horse and one cow to make up a team with which to leave the state in the spring. I will say here that most of the brethren from our branch returned to their old homes and soon neglected to observe or keep the counsel we had received upon our dismissal from the army. We did soon assemble ourselves together and rejoiced to think we were counted worthy to suffer for the gospel's sake. We did not have the prophet or bishops to govern us, though we would have rejoiced to have had them. I resumed my work as a shoemaker. Pork and corn were plentiful and cheap, and we had plenty to eat. During the course of the winter, I traded my horse, my remaining cow, and some spare clothing for a good yoke of oxen. Through the generosity of a brother by the name of Eleazar Brown, I obtained money and bought another yoke of oxen, which gave me a proper team and outfit. On the 12th day of March, in the year 1839, I, with my family together with Brother Brown and others, bid farewell to our Missouri home and started to seek a new home in a more congenial climate. We traveled on without any notable occurrences until the latter part of March, when we arrived safely in a little town called Atlas, on the border of the great Mississippi bottom in the state of Illinois. There, I met a brother-in-law who urged me to stay a few days, to which I consented. This separated me from Brother Brown, as he had taken the road leading north up the river in the direction of what later became Nauvoo. I stayed in Atlas for a few days, and during that time had a chance to sell my team, which I did. Being indebted to Brother Brown for a portion of the money used to purchase it, I immediately set out to find him and pay what I owed. I traveled about 12 miles up the river to a small town called Pleasantvale, where I found Brother Brown and his family. We were glad to see each other again, not knowing when we parted whether we should ever meet again in this life. I paid him what I owed, and he insisted I settle in that place, saying the people were friendly and there was plenty of food and resources. I looked around and soon found an old log cabin and 3 acres of ground, which I rented for the season. I quickly moved my family in and went to work planting corn and garden vegetables. The crops did well, and we had plenty to eat the following year. About this time, Joseph and Hiram escaped from Missouri and came to Quincy, Illinois, about 30 miles up the river from where I was. They soon called a meeting and gave general instructions to the saints who were in attendance, which were then distributed to others scattered throughout the country. Shortly after, they went out in search of a new location where the saints could once again gather together. They soon succeeded in purchasing a small vacated place called Commerce. The saints began gathering there like doves returning to their windows. This was about 50 miles up the Mississippi River from Quincy. Now I returned to my own circumstances. I went to work on my rented property, planting a garden and returning to my shoemaking work. I enjoyed my new home very much until sometime in the month of June, when I was visited by one of the original High Council. After learning that several saints were in that part of the country, he called them together and organized a branch of the church. I was chosen and set apart to preside over it and to hold meetings among ourselves. If invited by responsible citizens to preach, I was instructed to do so, which I did. The Lord blessed my labors. Many believed and were baptized, and the word prospered until October. There was to be a general conference held in Commerce on the 6th day of October in the year 1839. I attended, and I had never before seen such a sight. Those who had lived in commerce through the summer looked more like ghosts than people. They seemed to have neither flesh nor blood, but they were glad to be there and able to attend the conference. At that time, the location was organized into a stake of Zion, and the name was changed from Commerce to Nauvoo, a resting place. During the organization, I was chosen as one of the high counselors, but was later released after I explained to Joseph what I had been doing and what the prospects were in Pike County, where I had been laboring about 80 miles from Nauvoo. He told me to return and continue preaching. He said when the branch reached 100 members, he would come and organize it as a stake of Zion. I returned home to my field of labor. Doors were open on every hand. I preached and baptized, and in about 2 weeks, the branch numbered 112. I let Joseph know, as instructed, and though he was overburdened with responsibilities, he sent his brother Hiram and Bishop George Miller. They came and organized the branch into a stake of Zion, a resting place for the saints gathering from the east and south. I was ordained and set apart to preside, and William Orrid was ordained bishop. We were then instructed to obtain a piece of land, lay it out into town lots, build a meeting house, and provide for the comfort and convenience of the saints as they gathered in. We succeeded in doing so. We built a frame meeting house, if I remember correctly, 36 by 40 feet, and completed it. We held our meetings in it, and many of the old citizens joined the church. All went on comfortably until sometime in the summer or fall of the year 1842, when mobocracy and persecution began to show their hideous head. By that time, I had built myself a nice little home and was comfortably situated, but then a message came from the prophet instructing us to discontinue our organization and immigrate to Hancock County. Most of the branch submitted to the call, and in the spring of the year 1843, I moved with my family and located in a place called Green Plain, in the vicinity of Warsaw in Hancock County, where the notorious Levi Williams was one of my neighbors. There, I bought a farm on favorable terms and began improving it. I built a good house, a small grist mill, and put about 20 acres of land in a good state of cultivation with a strong fence around it. I was on good terms with my neighbors, although most of them were Gentiles. They seemed pleased with my efforts to improve the place, and all went well with me until sometime in June of the year 1844. At that time, reports about Joseph from Nauvoo caused some excitement, as priests, lawyers, and apostates had again conspired to stir up trouble. The men in the neighborhood where I lived had organized themselves to go to Nauvoo and assist in taking Joseph. They came and invited me to go with them, but I refused. They asked if I would go if the governor ordered me. I replied that I would not go, even if the devil himself ordered me to go against Joseph, for his people were my people, and where he went, I would go also. This seemed to vex them a little, although we had always been on good terms as neighbors. They then said, "Well, you'll have to leave, for you can't live here, although we like you as a neighbor." So they left me and soon started for Nauvoo, with old Colonel Levi Williams as their leader, which resulted in the martyrdom of Joseph the prophet and Hiram, the patriarch, along with the wounding of others, including Elder John Taylor, who later became the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This occurred at Carthage Jail on the 27th day of June in the year 1844. The desperadoes then returned to Green Plain without having thoroughly washed the black from their necks and faces, nor could they ever remove the stain from their character or consciences. They did not interfere with me again until about the 20th day of October in the year 1845. In the meantime, they began engaging in burning houses and plundering property in a little town called Lima, which had been mostly settled by saints. They sometimes even killed our brethren. On one particular day, an armed force of about 60 men came and set fire to my hay and grain stacks, then to the house itself. I will say here that at the time, I had 2 little boys lying at the point of death, one 4.5 years old, and the other 2.5 years old, Albert, the older, and Edward Parley Pine by name. They were carried out into the woods, and a bed was made for them on the ground by their mother. She placed bedding under them and set a large bedstead over them with plenty of covering to keep them from getting wet in the heavy rain that was rapidly approaching. While my wife and some courageous neighbors who had volunteered to help were carrying things out of the house, some of the mob scattered straw from a bed into the 4 corners of the room and set fire to it. The women tried to put the fire out, but some of the ruffians took my wife by the shoulders and threw her out of the house. She was not in a condition to be handled roughly without danger. The house burned down with nearly all of its contents. I was obliged to flee to save my life and remained in hiding until a very heavy thunderstorm came on. Then I ventured out to see what had become of my family. I found them all alive and without personal injury, but my house, grain, hay, and a considerable portion of my fencing had been burned to the ground. This left my field open to the commons, where I had about 1,000 bushels of corn, mostly in the shuck, now exposed to the ravages of hogs, sheep, and cattle roaming at large in great numbers. My wife begged me to leave again, as the mob was still hunting for me, so I was obliged to take shelter in a large shock of corn. But as it began to leak through onto me from the rain, I crawled out again and went to see how my family was faring. I found them somewhat more comfortable. A brother had come by and carried the sick children and their bedding into the mill, which the mob had not burned, supposing it belonged to someone else. Although the children had gotten a little wet in the movie, they were out of danger for the time being. I remained with them until nearly daylight, then ventured to the home of my nearest neighbor, a Baptist preacher named George Walker. When I arrived and began telling him what the mob had done, he said, "Mr. Draper, I know it. I saw it all, but I could do you no good, for I feared they would destroy me next. Is there anything I can do for you?" I said, "I would like to borrow your wagon to move my family away from the mob, and I will return it." He replied, "There is my wagon, take it. If you return it, all is well. If not, all is still well." I then returned to help my wife gather up the few remaining fragments of our possessions. By this time, daylight appeared, and while we were busy preparing to leave, lo and behold, we saw 10 armed men approaching. They were again in pursuit of me, and I was obliged to flee. I made my escape, but it was on my hands and knees through the brush. I succeeded in reaching another neighborhood, where I found a young man and asked him to go and let my family know where I was, and to help them pack up their things and bring them to me, which he did. I then took my family to Pike County, a distance of 50 miles, where I got them into a house with my wife's brother. After I had them comfortably situated, the next day being the 6th day of October, in the year 1845, my wife was confined and gave birth to another son. The 2 little boys who had been near death also soon began to recover. After all seemed safe and my family was provided for, I took my leave and started for Nauvoo, a distance of about 80 miles. I had to pass through a section of country where the mob was still active, roaming about, doing damage, and seeking the lives of men who would claim to be Latter-day Saints or Mormons. But I passed through unharmed and arrived safely in Nauvoo, where Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, then leading the church, were located. I told them what I had done, how and where I had left my home, and they highly approved. I then asked their counsel for my future movements. They said, "Brother William, if you wish to remain with the saints, go back and take care of your family, where they are the best you can through the winter, and make every effort you can to get ready and go with us next spring to the Rocky Mountains. But come again to Nauvoo in about 2 months and receive your endowment." I did as instructed and received my endowment on the 28th day of February in the year 1846. While I was there, several of the brethren crossed the Mississippi River into Iowa on their way to the mountains. I returned to Pike County and began making speedy preparations to follow them in the spring, which I did. I left Pike County about the 20th day of April in the year 1846 and went to Nauvoo, where I added a few more supplies to my family's outfit. On the 1st day of May in the same year, I crossed the Mississippi River and took the trail to follow those who had already started for the mountains, through a wilderness country where no white men lived. We made quite a company, and I was chosen as captain. We traveled about 200 miles without anything noteworthy taking place. One night, to our great surprise, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball returned from the Missouri River, the farthest point they had reached. They brought news that United States officers had met them and called for 500 able-bodied men from our traveling company to go to Mexico and fight their battles. This was quite a damper to us. Nevertheless, we continued traveling on, while Brigham and Heber went back east to meet with other companies. When we were about 6 miles from the Missouri River, we came to a halt and made camp to wait for Brigham to return, which he did in 2 or 3 days. A place was prepared, and the men were called together to meet with Brigham, the army officers, and Colonel Thomas L. Kane, who had heard of the call for troops and came to witness the result. After a short council, it was decided to respond to the government's request. A call for volunteers was issued, and within 24 hours, the required 500 men had more than volunteered. A large Bowery was erected at a little place known as Trading Point, settled only by Indians and their traders on the bank of the Missouri River. There we had a joyful parting dance. The next morning, being the 16th day of July, in the year 1846, marked the parting time between husbands and wives, fathers and children, brothers and sisters. 500 of our most able-bodied men were marched away across a 2,000-mile desert to fight the battles of the United States, the very country from which we had just been driven. Now I will leave those that had gone and turn to those that were left behind on the prairies. We could look in every direction and see the prairie dotted with wagons and tents, and speckled with cattle whose owners had gone. Something had to be done for the women and children left unprovided for and without protection in an Indian country. A meeting was immediately called, and the area was divided into districts or wards. Bishops were appointed, one to each ward. It fell to my lot to be one of them. When I went to look after those in my district, I found 33 families. Each bishop was to take charge and provide for all those in his ward. We immediately set to work, gathering cattle and assigning herdsmen to care for them. Next, we had to provide shelter for the people and care for the stock. As we had so few men remaining, we could not continue our journey until the brethren returned from the army, or until some other way was opened for our deliverance. So, with all our might, mind, and strength, we began building log cabins. Some we bought from the Indians, who were about to be driven from their homes by the government, as we already had been. About this time, Brigham and a large number of saints crossed the river to the west side onto the Omaha lands, not yet owned by the United States. They built a little town with over 500 houses. The rest of the saints remained on the east side of the river, on Potawatomi land, which the government was soon to claim. Those people were soon gathered into more compact settlements, where they could be better provided for and more easily protected. I located at a little place called Council Point, where there was a settlement of half-breeds and Indians. I bought one of their farms, which included a fairly comfortable house. I had previously built 2 cabins, as my family was large, but I was soon comfortably situated. The saints kept flocking in, and in a short time, we had a fine little town. It soon became necessary to organize Council Point into a branch of the church. I was chosen and ordained bishop and handled all church business that arose, according to the laws of the church. But circumstances and characters arose among us that church law did not fully provide for, and many of them were unwilling to be governed by what laws we did have. Iowa had not yet been organized with a territorial government and was without a civil code. In the absence of other laws, we went to work and organized a provisional government, including a lawmaking department. Officers were elected to administer the laws, as they were made or as the occasion required. I held a position in that department. We administered laws by issuing writs, punishing crime, assessing and collecting fines, and settling cases of debt, preserving peace and safety in the area. Everything moved along quietly. Some went to farming, while others sold their surplus clothing and possessions to merchants to obtain bread for the needy. We all were provided for, and the next year we raised enough for our own consumption. The country soon bore witness to the perseverance, industry, and thrift of its new settlers. All continued well under our system of government until the United States officially organized Iowa with a territorial government. We then ceased operating under our provisional government and sent our court records to Washington, D.C., where they received high approval. Now, I will say a few words about the company that crossed the river and built up winter quarters. A large number of them sickened and died from the privations and hardships they endured. However, those who survived began to revive when winter set in, and by spring had recovered sufficiently that a company, under the leadership of Brigham Young, was organized in April to serve as pioneers. About 100 men set out to cross the trackless plains, where only savages and wild beasts roamed, to seek a home for the saints in the valleys of the mountains, where they could serve the Lord and keep His commandments. I will not attempt to detail the many incidents of their journey, but let it suffice to say they arrived safely in the valley of the Great Salt Lake on the 24th day of July in the year 1847. There they located what became Salt Lake City, including the Temple Block and other public grounds, which stand as a testimony to their greatness, wisdom, and perseverance. In the spring of the year 1848, all who were able left winter quarters with its 500 houses and started to join the saints in the Salt Lake Valley. Those not able to go were taken back across the river into Iowa, where they were cared for by the brethren who remained behind. These saints were building flourishing towns and cultivating large farms, which produced abundantly. The chief place for public business was Canesville, named in honor of Colonel Thomas L. Kane for his kindness and gentlemanly conduct in visiting and witnessing our afflictions. Soon, Gentiles began arriving in Canesville with stores full of goods, providing the saints with necessities, luxuries, and everything needed to fit out for the journey west and for those staying behind a little longer. About this time, the brethren returned from the Mexican War and resumed care for their own families, relieving those who had carried the burden before them. In the spring of the year 1849, I was counseled to immigrate to Salt Lake that season. I obeyed the call and made speedy preparations. On the 5th day of July, I bid farewell to my home and friends at Council Point and went to join the company assembling at Old Winter Quarters. Upon arrival, we organized, and I was appointed by George A. Smith to help oversee the traveling company, along with Judge Appleby and Judge Clark. We began our journey across the plains to the Great Salt Lake. We traveled slowly, and nothing special occurred until the 2nd day of October, near the South Pass. There, we were caught in a great storm that lasted 36 hours and killed over 70 head of cattle and horses. This weakened our teams. After the storm, we shoveled our way out and continued traveling. Not many miles further, we reached a region without snow and enjoyed fair weather from that point on. On the 26th day of October in the year 1849, we arrived safely in Salt Lake City and broke up camp. We had been 4.5 months on the plains and were happy to meet our brethren, who, like us, had come up through great tribulations to make a home in the mountains. I stayed a few days with my brother Zenard and rented a house and lot for 1 year. My family being large, I had to exert myself to provide for them. Flour, before the harvest, sold for 75 cents to $1 per pound. It was hard to obtain seed grain, but I succeeded in getting enough, and my family did not suffer or go without bread. During the winter, I bought a little farm and rented another about 6 miles south of the city. It was too far to farm and return daily, so I bought a small log cabin, and in February moved part of my family to Mill Creek, where the farm was located. I planted potatoes on the city lot and wheat and corn on the farm, raising a good crop of each. I had enough for the coming year and some to spare. In the summer of the year 1850, a new settlement was started at what was then called South Willow Creek, about 20 miles south of Salt Lake City. I was invited to settle there, and in November of that year, I moved my entire family. I took up land, made a good farm, and raised plenty of grain, cattle, and horses. The settlement grew, and it became necessary to organize it into a branch of the church. I was called to preside and serve as bishop, having already been ordained to that office. I served in that capacity until the close of the year 1857. In the spring of the year 1858, I was again obliged to leave a good home and move south with the saints. I went as far south as Spanish Fork, about 42 miles. I located there, never expecting to return to my former home. I purchased 4 houses and lots, and about 80 acres of land, over 50 of which were good for farming and the rest for pasture. I raised plenty of grain for my needs and had much to spare. Things went well until the year 1862, when grasshoppers and crickets destroyed my crops. In the following year, 1863, the crops again failed, and grain rose to $5 a bushel. Firewood was hard to get, being far away, and I had 4 fires to keep up. My older sons had all married and left home, and I was left with a large family of small children and only their mothers to help. Considering all these disadvantages, I found my property disappearing faster than I could sustain. 1 bushel of wheat per day for bread cost $5, and I needed 2 loads of wood per week, each taking 2 or 3 days to gather. I realized I could not keep living that way, so I sold out and moved to Sanpete County, where cedar wood was plentiful and where much of our breadstuff was produced. In the fall of the year 1864, I sold my property in Spanish Fork for less than half its value. Early in the year 1865, I moved to Moroni, Sanpete County, where I bought a house, a lot, and about 15 acres of land for which I paid $900 in property. I also bought 1/3 of an old gristmill, worth about $400 or $500, for which I agreed to pay $1,500. I thought I could make bread with the mill and save some expense. I paid $500 down in property and spent $200 or $300 more on repairs, but only realized about $100 value from the entire investment. Still, I made bread with it by working hard and raising some grain on my land. Since then, the mill and land are gone. I have had anxieties, but now my young and helpless children are grown men and women able to care for themselves and help their mothers. As for myself, I think I shall not need assistance, for I do not wish to be burdensome to my children or anyone else. I will say I have lived in Moroni for nearly 17 years, but I am sorry to say that in this short period, I have suffered more in body and mind than I have in all the rest of my life, although I have spent nearly 55 years in this church. But when I was about to sink under the weight and influence of temptation, the Lord fulfilled his promise, wherein he said, "You shall not be tempted more than you are able to bear, but in every hour of temptation I will make a way for your escape." He did so by sending his servant, President John Taylor, on or about the 18th day of August, in the year 1880. He invited me into the house of Bishop J. W. Irons. After being seated, he asked me a few questions, which I answered briefly. Then he called upon one of his counselors, George Q. Cannon, and one of the apostles, Erastus Snow, and they laid their hands upon my head and reordained me to all the offices and various grades of priesthood to which I had previously been ordained. They also confirmed and reconfirmed all the blessings ever pronounced upon me, and ordained me to the office of patriarch after the ancient order. This seemed to impart new life, vigor, and spirit to me. Yet, I find I am on the decline as far as bodily strength is concerned and must before long lay off this mortal tabernacle, and my spirit must go to rest, or to join those who have gone before me, who have passed through great tribulations and have conquered the last enemy. For this reason, I have written this imperfect narrative, so my children, grandchildren, and all my posterity to the latest generation may know what their progenitor and those he associated with in this church had to endure for the gospel's sake. I now bear my testimony to the truthfulness of what I have written, though there may be some small errors in dates, nothing intentional or that would affect the truthfulness of the record. I also bear testimony to the truth of the everlasting gospel as revealed to this generation by Joseph Smith, the prophet, and as now being preached by his successors and the elders of Israel, who are going forth to carry the glad tidings of salvation to the nations of the earth. And I call upon all men, Jew and Gentile, bond and free, priest and people, at home or abroad, who have not obeyed the gospel, to listen, hear, believe, and be baptized for the remission of their sins, and have hands laid upon them by one having authority for the gift of the Holy Ghost, and they shall receive it. For the promise is unto you, to your children, and to all that are afar off, as many as the Lord our God shall call. Now, in conclusion, I will say that I have been about 2 weeks writing this imperfect narrative, and will now close on this 11th day of December in the year 1881, which makes me 74 years, 7 months, and 17 days old. I am the husband of 5 living wives, the father of 51 children, grandfather to about 100, and great-grandfather to about 20 more. And now I leave my blessing upon them all, and ask my heavenly Father to seal upon them the blessings of Abraham and Isaac. William Draper